Alright folks, with a possible 2-year wait in between seasons, I thought it would be a fun idea to go through everything we know regarding the Nightwalker monsters featured in MGM's From, which is a show I've grown to absolutely adore for its abundance of mysteries. These creatures aren't officially called Nightwalkers by any means, but I thought it was appropriate given they walk at night, so hopefully that's not too controversial. This is just a way to differentiate them from the other entities in the show as they aren't officially named, and a video title like The Monsters Explored could lead to some confusion. I'm going to structure this video by going through what we've learned chronologically, but remember, this show is far from over, so a lot of information is still up for interpretation, or could be subject to change in future installments. You may think I'm getting off track at some points with plot lines that seem unrelated. However, that is the very nature of this show. Most things appear disconnected at first, but do eventually link together. And what doesn't has enough content to speculate on for future seasons. Obviously, this video will be filled with spoilers, so if you're looking to go into the series completely blind, it's probably best to give this one a skip. But with that, if you end up enjoying this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button and drop a sub to see more content like this. When entering the mysterious Fromville, 3 things are guaranteed to happen. The first, a tree will block your way in the road, forcing you to double back before encountering the strange small town where nothing quite makes sense. Second, the street will endlessly loop back to the town's entrance, trapping you inside what some speculate to be a pocket dimension with no escape. Or so we've been told. And the third, horrifying monsters that initially appear human will come for you, specifically after sundown, before viciously tearing you apart if you're caught outside. These things don mid-20th century clothing and costumes of all types such as Western wear, sailor suits, and regular everyday attire, presumably in an attempt to blend in or distract the townsfolk with the resources they have. It's like their idea of mimicking a person, as their true skin has the appearance of something rather vampiric with their pale faces, sharp teeth, and razor claws. While typically hunting in packs, they always walk, never run, as if to taunt the scared townsfolk by letting them know no matter how long you try to evade them, the creatures will inevitably catch you. We don't see many, if any, instances of these things actually consuming their victims on screen, which terrifyingly implies they kill for sport rather than survival. They are far from mindless monsters, proven by their ability to manipulate those who fall for their charm into letting them inside their homes. Such is the case with the Nightwalker that calls herself Jasmine, who convinces a survivor named Kevin to open a colony house window in the pursuit of love, which obviously leads to a violent massacre within. Not even children are safe from this horrific fate, as we see from the show's opening scene after 96 days without an incident. Side note, both Jasmine and the old woman monsters appear at windows that are on second floors, which I find significantly creepier considering they would have to climb up the buildings to reach them. But what's stopping these creatures from just busting down the door? Well, that would be thanks to the talismans. Mysterious rocks covered in unknown symbols that prevent the Nightwalkers from entering any enclosed space as long as said talisman is hanging up near a door. You can't just walk around with one in your hand and expect to be safe, but something as fragile as a tent is enough to make them effective. Before they were found by Boyd in a small hut out in the forest preceding the events of the main series, survivors would hide in bushes, holes, and any other secret rooms in an attempt to avoid the monsters every single night. Back then, they used to shriek as a form of intimidation for the scared townsfolk, but after the talisman's discovery, they began to whisper instead. Nobody knows who created these strange rocks, what placed them in the hut, or why they work. All we know is they are essential in order to live here rather than just survive. It seems the townsfolk of Fromville are caught in some supernatural game controlled by a higher power, as the plot of the show revolves around uncovering the rules and figuring out how to win, with the only clues to the past lying within the faded memories of a man named Victor who has lived in this place since he was a young boy, and was the sole survivor of a great massacre that wiped everybody out, which alone is a huge mystery we're still waiting on answers for. The first instance we see of our characters encountering a scenario unlike the typical status quo is when Sarah hears the voice of an entity that convinces her to open the medical bay doors, leaving all within to die horrifically at the hands of the Nightwalkers. This event tells us there is something independent out there working to the monster's benefit by manipulating the survivors to make their job easier. But what? Well, that question would remain a mystery for another 2 seasons, but that doesn't mean we don't learn plenty about the town and the monsters during this time. Come the second half of Season 1, we are presented with many different mysteries that initially appear unrelated to the Nightwalkers, such as the introduction of faraway trees that act as warp points, taking you to random areas across Fromville when entered, and the presence of a mysterious ghostly kid dubbed the Boy in White who only appears to few, acting as a sort of guide for those he deems worthy. Or the question of where the power comes from as Tabitha tracks the electrical wires to their house's basement, where they appear to go straight down into the ground. But when a mysterious voice warns Jim to stop his wife from digging over a makeshift radio they built, we soon realized they were getting a little too close to answers as the Matthews house basement crumbles with Tabitha inside. But how does this relate to the monsters? Well, in the Season 1 finale / Season 2 premiere, we're shown Tabitha's fate as she wakes up in a tunnel system beneath the town where she strangely finds no source for the power, which in my mind almost mirrors the Nightwalkers themselves, as the town too is trying to mimic what humans perceive as normal. And although Victor arrives to rescue her via the Boy in White's instructions through a faraway tree, the two were far from safe as they discover the sleeping bodies of the creatures scattered throughout the caverns. It's clear this is their home and where they go during the day. But what I find extremely disturbing is the presence of random objects all around and vague depictions of what looks to be their history on the walls. This tells us these creatures take things they like from their victims and record their past, which is not only the scariest thing I've ever heard, but definitively proves they are independent thinkers and have their own will despite possibly serving a higher power. However, where some mysteries are closed, others are opened as deeper within the cave, Tabitha and Victor discover a type of toy-like structure that is knocked down by a ball thrown from one of many makeshift cages in the room. And after investigating further, Tabitha is jump-scared by what looks to be a deformed child that stares her down before disappearing just as quick. This is a big WTF in the moment. But the non-hostile encounter could almost be taken for a warning as moments later the nocturnal creatures begin to wake. Thankfully, the two make it out with their lives unbeknownst to the townsfolk. However, this is where things start to get interesting in regards to the Nightwalker's behavior, as while trying to dig his wife out of the rubble, Jim, along with Tom and one of the new bus arrivals, find themselves trapped after dark by the rest of the collapsing house, leading to the monsters coming for them like any other. All except Jim, who makes it through the night untouched. This is the first instance we see of the Nightwalkers actively choosing not to kill someone they have dead to rights. There's no scenario where they just didn't see him, in my opinion. And their strange behavior on this night wouldn't end here, as the creatures had additionally come for some of the new bus arrivals. However, despite most receiving the typical treatment, others, such as a young couple, are tortured throughout the night as the girl is forced to watch her boyfriend die slowly before suffering a soon-to-be fatal wound to the head as she claims they wanted to play with her in her final moments. These strange encounters really throw some of the game's rules we thought we knew into question. It seems the more we learn about this town and the mysteries within, the more sadistic the threats become. Clearly, knowledge comes with a price in this place, and sometimes that takes on more forms than just death. But unfortunately, this message hadn't yet sunk in for our characters around this time, as after journeying deep into the woods in search of answers with Sarah, Boyd is indirectly instructed by the boy in white to enter a faraway tree, warping him to a hole in a mysterious dungeon. This is probably one of the more confusing moments of the show, as after hearing the voice of a man named Martin chained to the wall above, Boyd is thrown a rope that he climbs before attempting to break the malnourished man free. But during this time, he hears a music box that is warned to be a sign of something terrible to come once it stops playing, and after strangely naming Boyd's wife as if he knew who he was, Martin leans over in pain before cutting the sheriff and grabbing his wound tight while telling him, "My blood is your blood now," as he passes away. What this did was essentially put what we're told are worms beneath Boyd's skin that only he can see. And despite seeming trapped in this dungeon, he stumbles through the door only to appear in a pile of ruins right outside the town, implying that place itself was some sort of pocket dimension within the pocket dimension. Or something. Confused yet? Well, so were most of us. Especially after Boyd begins suffering hallucinations of the so-called music box entity after returning to town as a result of the worms he claims are growing in strength. Almost like a warning of its arrival if he didn't tread carefully. But again, how does this relate to the Nightwalkers? Well, after getting trapped in the med bay following an accident involving his son Ellis, Boyd decides to do something more reckless than anyone could imagine as he steps out into the street while calling out for the monsters to come and face him. Which one certainly does. The creature the fans have dubbed Smiley, who arrives along with 4 others intending to make him suffer. But in one of Season 2's most shocking moments, the sheriff cuts his hand open and approaches Smiley, who confusingly doesn't attempt to attack, before slicing his throat open and pressing his hand up while reciting the whole "My blood is your blood" saying, which surprisingly causes Smiley to begin violently screeching and convulsing as he collapses to the ground and dies. The other creatures don't even attack Boyd after either. They simply step toward the body and stare at each other without smiles on their faces, as if they've never seen this happen before. This event cured Boyd of the worms, whatever they were, but seemingly unleashed something else as the death of Smiley sets upon the music box entity in the form of cicadas that torture and nearly kill Julie, Randall, and Marielle within their dream/subconscious. I won't go too in depth with the music box entity, as it could honestly have its own dedicated video since it does appear to be its own creature separate from anything we've seen before. But in my mind, this is either an extreme example of knowledge coming with a price in this place, or it's the town/the grand entity itself telling our characters, this is not what you're supposed to do. You are not supposed to kill the monsters, and this is the punishment for doing so. Kind of like the most hardcore round of hot or cold you've ever played. The boy in white must have known this would happen, so why would he allow Boyd to fall into this trap by sending him straight to Martin? Well, unfortunately, this is a question that has yet to be answered in future seasons. All we know is, despite Boyd finding his way back to the dungeon and destroying the music box which seemingly released the victims at the time, the influence of the entity would still linger within their minds going into future seasons. At the very least, this whole event wasn't entirely for nothing, as Smiley's body would be used in an autopsy that reveals these things are basically entirely human inside. Their organs are all shriveled up, and there's no blood flowing, but they are, or at least were, human. And despite this lack of blood, our characters were able to obtain a vial of bile from the creature that was theorized to still contain the worms, but would be proven otherwise merely 2 episodes later. Still, the information gathered from the corpse was valuable nonetheless. The origin of the worms is just something that is beyond us at this point in time. But from what we've gathered, I'd say it's safe to assume they act as a type of containment for the music box entity, only unleashed when someone's overconfidence gets the best of them. Yet, in spite of the horrors that have been faced, there are still glimpses of hope for the future, as Ellis's wife Fatima learns she is pregnant right around the same time as Smiley's death. regardless of being told she couldn't have children. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. However, Season 2's mysteries still don't end here. Since arriving back to town from the caves, Tabitha has been regularly harassed by ghostly children that strongly resemble the one she saw in the cage who repeat the word Onkui before disappearing right in front of her. But she wouldn't be the only one experiencing this type of strangeness, as Jade 2 throughout the series has been seeing visions of all types of things like a Civil War soldier or a crushed man screaming. But most intriguing was a symbol only he could see that for the longest time had no explanation. That is, until his search for answers come the Season 2 finale, as Jade purposefully locates and enters the monster's cave where he stumbles upon what can only be described as a depiction of some sort of sacrificial ritual, with those ghostly Onkui children appearing around him on beds of stone, directly under a hole to the surface with that very same symbol created by the roots of the trees that once again disappear before his very eyes. Now, I know this whole Onkui kid thing seems unrelated from the monsters, but I promise you both are very much intertwined, as Tabitha's curiosity in the children brings her to Victor, who we previously learned had a mother named Miranda convinced she could save the kids who were trapped in a tower, but died on her way to what Victor refers to as the bottle tree, due to its abundance of glass bottles hanging from the branches with strange notes of numbers found inside, which is said to be a special faraway tree as it will take you to the tower every time, given you're a main character and not some C-lister. The similarities in experiences lead Tabitha to believe her visions are meant as a call for her to finish what Miranda couldn't. So passing through after Victor gives her his lunchbox for luck, she exits at the mysterious tower as expected. But instead of finding the children inside, she encounters the boy in white who tells her this is the only way before pushing her out the window. However, instead of death, she wakes up in a hospital in Camden, Maine, which just so happens to be the home city of Victor's father. This is quite the cliffhanger, as we know now it is possible to leave the town. But without getting too off track, this outing brings Tabitha to the still grieving Henry, who, upon learning of his family's fate, shows Tabitha Miranda's old paintings of the town from before she ever ended up there, inspired by visions in her dreams, which implies it was always her destiny to go there and save the children, with her failure being left for Tabitha to pick up for reasons that are still to come. But much like Miranda, Tabitha herself faces destiny merely a couple episodes later, as she is brought right back to the town via ambulance with Henry in her company. However, once again, this instance of finding answers will be accompanied with another step up in sadism, as Boyd, among others, are baited into the street by the creatures, who set their livestock loose before capturing both he and the beloved Tian Chen in the barn, where they cuff the sheriff to a pole and make him watch as they slowly rip her apart in front of him, all while directly saying they weren't gonna kill him as that would be no fun. Instead, they want to break him mentally, which not only shows us the monster's purpose isn't just to end their victims, but to maintain fear while preventing them from putting together the puzzle's pieces. And this would be taken even further on the night of Tabitha's re-arrival too, as the monsters lure the EMTs from the ambulance out under the guise of needing help, forcing Boyd and some of the other townsfolk to rush out and assist those in peril. Just like the creatures intended, as the once lawful sheriff is given the choice to either save those within the ambulance or save Randall, who has been surrounded and subdued by hallucinations of cicadas, which he of course in the moment chooses to take the ambulance keys, as the guilt of making a decision immediately sets in, even more so when it's revealed the creatures only maimed Randall, but left him alive as a way to take away the town's trust from their sheriff. These things are not only terrifying, but extremely intelligent. Unfortunately, the relentless horrors brought on by the town wouldn't end here, as Fatima begins to see some rather strange complications with her pregnancy. The only thing she can hold down without getting sick are rotten vegetables from the garden, which is weird enough alone, But after an ultrasound from the ambulance reveals nothing inside the womb and her cravings turn to a lust for human blood, it becomes quite clear whatever is going on here is no miracle. Even more so when a kid named Elgin is regularly visited by an entirely new entity, dubbed the Kimono Woman, who convinces the confused boy to help her bring on the baby's growth in order to go home. Much like how Sarah was influenced by an unseen presence in the past, which he does by essentially kidnapping her and hiding her in a secret room, following a murder she committed brought on by the growing dark force inside, where he then feeds her gallons of blood from God knows where, which causes the baby to grow rapidly throughout the day. Despite what the ultrasound displayed, there was something inside. According to the kimono lady, it just wasn't hers. Stay with me here. As this is going on, Tabitha's pursuit of answers causes Victor to confront his own past, which eventually leads him to recall a conversation he heard as a boy between a long-dead man named Christopher and the boy in white himself, who told him the answers to the end are at the beginning. It started with the children, what the others did to them, the people they loved, the people they trusted. The children were born in the dark, and then they were murdered in the dark. But someone who loved them told them a story. The story gave them hope, and when the children laid on the stones, they poured their hope into the roots that make the symbol, and those roots became the tree. The boy in white told Christopher in order to save the children, he would have to go through the bottle tree, but he refused. This is quite a lot of information to take in. Everything here began with the children, as they were sacrificed in the dark before creating the faraway trees through hope inspired by someone who loved them. But with Fatima already nearing the end of her pregnancy, the entire town's focus would shift to finding her in spite of these revelations. However, while out searching in the woods, one of the children guides Tabitha to the root cellar that just happened to be the last place Miranda was seen alive as Victor stands dwelling on the past. But after touching his shoulder while trying to comfort him, Tabitha is overcome with emotion as the memories of Miranda's death begin to flood back. The memories of her own death. It wasn't so much destiny inspiring them to save the children as it was their own will from the past, as Tabitha herself was the reincarnation of Miranda, who was the reincarnation of another unfortunate soul who failed the children, and so on. They've come back over and over again to fulfill their mission, but have failed every single time. It seems freeing the children, or presumably their souls, is indeed the path to victory and freedom in this great game. So much so that during Miranda, or Tabitha's flashback, we see her reach the tree only to encounter Smiley himself, who not only looks the exact same, meaning these things don't age, but sprints at her before lunging, telling us there was no time here to mess around. Something about Miranda arriving at the bottle tree during the night was an urgent matter that required they stray from their normal behavior. But this mind-bending revelation of reincarnation wasn't isolated to just Tabitha, as the uncovering of the numbers within the bottle tree's letters reveal music notes to a song that was sung to the children at their darkest of times, left behind by their preceding lives to help them remember the past. Jade, too, is one of these individuals who has returned once again to fulfill the role he denied as Christopher. And right as the song comes to an end, one of the children approach and repeat Ankui, or remember, as the two recall the memories of having been the parents of the girl in a life long before, who tried to save her from the others' intentions to sacrifice but failed. But who were these others that murdered the children in the dark? Well, as Fatima finally gives birth to what can only be described as a sack at the hands of the kimono woman, Boyd and Ellis arrive moments later as the sheriff follows the entity down into a tunnel, only to witness the monsters gathered around the cave in some sort of ritualistic form as the sack grows only to reveal the rebirth of Smiley. While in labor, Fatima had seen the truth. They were the ones who sacrificed the children in a time long ago, whether it was a mother, father, sister, brother, or even a grandparent, they were all promised the same thing by it: eternal life. The children were born in the dark and were raised in the dark, before being murdered in the dark by the ones they loved through sacrifice, as they were promised immortality by something beyond them if they followed through. Perhaps out of fear from this place and the entity, or maybe by their own desire. But like many deals with dark forces, this was a curse rather than a blessing. They would certainly live forever, but in a horrible, monstrous form bound to the rules of its own desire, with not only their insides shriveling up, but their souls as well. They don't eat their victims because they don't need to. Even if they are killed, there are entities on standby, such as the kimono woman, assuring a swift return through an infertile womb. The first iterations of Jade and Tabitha, from what's conveyed, were the individuals who told the kids a story that gave them hope. A story of freedom that poured their emotions into the roots, creating the faraway trees. A physical depiction of the children's desire to escape. But what was it? What promised these sick individuals this cursed eternal life? Well, in the very next scene, we see Jim reeling himself in from the craziness surrounding this place, as he's approached in broad daylight by an entity that's been dubbed the Man in Yellow, who directly tells us exactly what we've suspected all along. Knowledge comes with a price, as he lets him know his wife shouldn't have dug that hole before ripping his throat out in Season 3's final moments. Now, we don't know for sure this is the grand entity responsible for everything going on here, but I'm led to believe so due to these scenes coming in succession. This thing has clearly been watching and speaking to our characters throughout the series in many different ways, and judging by Jim's death, acts as the judge, jury, and executioner of the rules. Tabitha had gone deeper for answers than anyone else, and despite this entity's attempts to warn Jim of her actions, payment had to be dealt for these revelations. Whether the Man in Yellow is the grand entity or not, the monsters were convinced to commit the worst of crimes, which began a multi-generational cycle of trying and failing to save the children. We can see some of this contextualized through the monsters' depictions in the cave, but a lot of these images are still unclear in their history. We see what looks to be a retelling of the would-be monsters' arrival on what I think are boats near the tower, which could relate to Ethan's story about the Lake of Tears, and the same symbols that appear on the talismans are etched around this scene, but also around what could be a depiction of the town's first farm near the colony house, with the survivors painted red as a way to convey they are the enemies or targets of the creatures. Perhaps the presence of the talisman symbols around the farm are meant to infer the more progress the townsfolk make, the less power the monsters retain. But let's say the color red is supposed to be associated with the enemies of the creatures. It's interesting that what looks to be a depiction of the grand entity is painted in that color. Perhaps this is to throw into question how the monsters truly feel about it and their curse. But in reality, these are way too vague to say for certain with the knowledge we have as of now. So this just means there's much more story left to tell with these creatures in future seasons. But there you have it. This, as of the end of Season 3, is everything I could find about the monsters and their role in the show. There are many hanging plot threads left that I didn't mention, such as the dog, the change in weather, and the mysterious village in the forest. But as of right now, these have no relevance to the topic of today's video. However, one of the more mysterious events that do need some explaining is the great massacre that occurred during Victor's childhood. The way these people were killed does fit the monster's MO, but they could have done this at any time without the talismans present. What changed then? Well, perhaps that relates to the great game itself. Maybe each generation of townsfolk are brought in as an attempt to create more Nightwalker monsters. And when it fails with the survivors getting too close to the end, the grand entity resets while leaving a sole survivor behind to pass on the horrific truth that there is no escape. But why would this thing need monsters to begin with? Why does it need people within the town? And what role does the boy in white play in the monster's history? Well, until Season 4 airs, we are only left to speculate. So let me know in the comments down below, what do you think is really going on in this town? When do you think all this began, and how do you think these people were convinced to sacrifice their children? With a show of this nature, it's quite possible I could have missed something or made a mistake. So if I did, feel free to correct me in the comments. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. Thank you so much for watching.